discussing in our seminars together, a major feature of the Torah of David Hartman was on the meaning of the modern state of Israel, and therefore a big feature of what we want to do is to also, if we're going to bring people for these types of immersive and rigorous study programs in Jerusalem, to actually talk about the place where we are. The lay leaders had an opportunity with Micha and myself to talk about some of the major issues facing Israel. The rabbis will have that opportunity later in the program with folks like Tzifi Livni and Ilana Dayan and others to also hear about some of the contemporary issues facing the state of Israel. What we wanted to do tonight is actually turn the lens a little bit on the state of affairs in North American Jewry. Needless to say, and we'll get into this a little bit more deeply, this is an unbelievably interesting time for the North American Jewish community, with perhaps a set of challenges, complexities of identity and of belonging that are, in some ways, some of the best challenges the Jewish people have ever faced in any diaspora. And at the same time, invariably they form the curriculum for much of the leadership of the rabbis in this room and the lay leaders in the room, trying to ask the question of how do we adapt our Jewish ideas and our Jewish lives to these set of challenges that are, and sometimes great challenges, and nevertheless challenges all the same. Tonight we have an opportunity to engage with two of, I must say very simply, two of the North American Jewish community's most wonderful thought leaders. Two individuals who embody willingness. Where's the other panel? Two individuals who embody a willingness to lead through ideas and at the same time to lead significant communal institutions serving the needs of the Jewish people. I want to emphasize, given what Lauren said today in introducing the rabbinic program, David Hartman and this institution's love of rabbis and synagogues is very deep. I think we have more rabbis here this summer than we've ever had studying at the Institute. I think we have over 170 rabbis. And I'm going to go out on a limb and ask how many of the lay leaders who are here for the lay leadership program are members of synagogues? So this is an institution that loves rabbis, believes in synagogues, and even if all of you who raised your hands are now in the minority of the American Jewish community, our starting point as an institute is still to celebrate the role of rabbinic leadership and synagogue leadership in Jewish life. And so it's very telling that the speakers we have tonight are both are really important rabbis in the American Jewish community. Rabbi Ed Feinstein at Shalom in Encino, and not too far away geographically, Rabbi Sharon Brous of Ikar. And both Rabbis Feinstein and Brous serve on the faculty of the Shalom Hartman Institute in North America, as well as writing, speaking, and teaching across the country. So thank you both for being on the panel tonight. I'll serve in the role this time just as moderator. I'm going to ask a few questions. We'll hear from both of our presenters, and then we'll open up for a larger conversation. I want to start with what hopefully is an easy question, which is, I'd love to hear from both of you about what are the aspects of Jewish life in North America that actually make you optimistic about the future of the Jewish community and communities in North America. What are the features that you think need to be celebrated and emphasized using one of my colleagues was talking about today, a language of appreciative inquiry? And what are the phenomena or features of Jewish life in North America that make you, I don't want to say pessimistic, but perhaps concerned? And since you've been in this baby rush more times, we'll start with Rabbi Feinstein.
Good evening. I'm never in Jerusalem without an acute awareness of how remarkable it is to be in Jerusalem. The first time I came to the city, I came on a youth program, and I called my grandmother, my Lithuanian Bubby, and said, I'm going to Yerushalayim to study for the summer at the Hebrew University. I'm going to study philosophy with Jewish kids from across the world. And I'll be back at the end of the summer. And Bubby said, you're going to Yerushalayim, HaKodesh, to study in Hebrew at a Hebrew University with Jewish children from around the world. You're going to be studying Torah. My uncle's going to study Torah in a Hebrew University. I said, Taka Mashiach Zeit. It's remarkable. And you can't walk the streets of this city without feeling how remarkable that is. So I think it's important to do this properly, with apologies to my friend the moderator. But we don't come together simply, this is not a theater, and Sharon and I are not here to perform for you tonight. This is a Beit Midrash, where a community of concerned learning Jews comes together to share Torah. So we have to share Torah, and you cannot share Torah as strangers. You have to do this as a community of chaverim, as friends. So pardon me this indulgence. I want everybody to stand up. And I want you to turn around and find someone you haven't met yet and say hello and introduce yourself.
My goal is, I came here to study at Hartman, and my goal is when I go back to Toronto, to the synagogue, to teach a course in Hartman. Isn't that chutzpah? That's great. I love it.
All right, now don't sit down. Stand up. You're going to be sitting the whole damn week. Stand up. Stand up. Stand up. Stand up. Stand up. You've got to do this right. Now, Sharon and I are both from California, so indulge me another one. We are now chaverim who have come together to share Torah. So put your arms around the people beside you. This way. This way, even if you don't like the session, you'll go home and say, I stood next to the nicest smelling Jew from Newton, Massachusetts. And we have to say two prayers of thanksgiving for the opportunity to sit together in a Beit Midrash in the city of Yerushalayim in this wonderful year of Jewish life. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'tzivatav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shecheyanu v'kimanu v'giyanu l'zman hazeh. Od yavo shalom aleinu. Od yavo shalom aleinu. Od yavo shalom aleinu ve'afulah. Od yavo shalom aleinu. Od yavo shalom aleinu. Od yavo shalom aleinu ve'afulah. Salam aleinu ve'al kol ha'olam. Salam, salam. Shalom aleinu ve'al kol ha'olam. Salam, shalom. Od yavo shalom aleinu. Od yavo shalom aleinu. Od yavo shalom aleinu ve'al. Professor Kurtzer, that's going to save the American Jewish community. The American Jewish community is not going to be saved by a selection of programs or technology or marketing. It's going to be saved because we build relationships among Jews. We build relationships with Jewish tradition, and we build relationships with God. A few blocks from here lived a great philosopher by the name of Martin Buber, who taught that God is found in the betweenness, between I and thou. And what we just did is what's going to save the American Jewish community if we do it religiously, every single time we gather together as chaverim. The answer to your question is as follows. In March of 1964, Look magazine, which was the second most popular news magazine in America, published a cover article called The Vanishing American Jew. It's by a Harvard sociologist who said that American ethnic groups assimilate out of existence once they reach the fourth generation. The first generation are immigrants, they know the language, the folk ways, the old ways. The second generation speaks to their parents in that language, even though they assimilate into America. The third generation still has Yiddish or Cambodian or Spanish or Italian-speaking grandparents. By the fourth generation, ethnic identity becomes kitsch. It's not powerful anymore. So he said in 1964, the American Jewish community is reaching its third generation, and that by the turn of the century, there'll be nobody left. Well, Look magazine is gone. And we're still here. Now, why is that? Because the rubric of ethnic group assimilation, the sociology of ethnic assimilation, isn't the only rubric under which American Jews function. There's another rubric. The other rubric is that in the history of American religion, there is a dynamic at work. There are periods of quiescence when religion is sort of standard and normal. And there are eruptions of reawakenings in American religious life. Reawakenings, renewals, revivals. In 1730, the First Great Awakening. In 1820, in 1870, in 1900, and again in about 1970, there were eruptions of religious enthusiasm in American cultural life. Now, if you chart those dates, and then you chart the dates of the significant dates of the American Jewish community, you discover that we also experienced revivals and reawakenings, but 20 years after the Protestants. So 1820 was the Second Great Awakening, and in 1840, Isaac Mayer Wise begins to put together a Minhag America. In 1870, there's an awakening. And in 1888, there's an awakening among Jews. In 1900, there's an awakening among Protestants. And in the 1920s, you have Stephen Wise and Abba Hillel Silver and Joseph Lookstein. And then in the 70s, you have the eruption of megachurches. And that means that we are now living through one of the great Jewish awakenings in American religious history. The rubric of religious awakenings is the other way to consider how American Jewish life works. And that's why you see the decline of an ethnic Judaism. My friend Stephen Cohen is here, who is one of the people who has the ability and the courage to tell us the truth about ourselves. And he'll tell you that in his latest study of New York Jewry, there is a sharp rise in the number and in the enthusiasm of the Orthodox communities, particularly the ultra-Orthodox communities, and a sharp diminishment of the non-Orthodox communities, and a sharp diminishment of ethnic Judaism in New York. As an ethnic community, we are declining. But as a religious community, we are surging. And that's why Sharon is here. Because nobody could have predicted Ikar. I grew up in Los Angeles. I know LA Jewish life very well. I've worked there for the last 25 years. Nobody could have predicted it. In fact, nobody could have predicted it so effectively that when Sharon said to me, I'm leaving Milken, I'm leaving a well-paid, steady job to start a religious community, I said, never, I'll feed your family, Come work at Valley Shalom. We'll give you a job, I don't want you to be hungry. Nobody could have predicted this. Because these eruptions of religious enthusiasm sort of come out of nowhere. But this is part of the story of American religious life and part of the story of American Jewish life. So the answer to your question is, it's going to be way different than my Zayda's Judaism, but it's going to thrive.
So it's really an honor. As we started, Yehuda turned to me and said, have you ever sat up at this table before? And I said, but many times I've come up after sessions and waited online to talk to the people who sat up at this table. So it's really an honor to be here with so many friends and teachers of mine and my family also from the U.S. and from Yerushalayim. So thank you for having me here. Rabbi Ed Feinstein and I sat on a panel together once before, several years ago, and I started by saying that right before the session started, I prayed to God and I said, please God, don't let me speak after Ed Feinstein. But then I did have to, and it was, as it is tonight, quite disruptive. So And then, by the way, then years later, the punchline to this story is that some angry person got to publish an article about me saying, what's the big deal about Sharon Brous? She's not all that great. I once saw her on a panel with Ed Feinstein. And let me tell you, she's no Ed Feinstein. To which I say, duh. Okay, so a few things. He's Ed Feinstein, for God's sake. Okay,
I wrote a response to that one. And he said, I'm no Sharon Brous.
Okay. As Ed puts forward, it is true. I mean, there is, we all read Stephen Cohen, a precipitous decline. Some people say a demographic freefall, that the American Jewish community is in demographic freefall. You don't feel it when you're here in this incredibly lively, vibrant, beautiful bunch of American Jews. But we see it in reality. We see it when we meet people, in particular young people, and some of the most dynamic, smartest, most interesting young people, and they are completely disconnected from the Jewish conversation, from the Jewish community. And so on one side, we see this really strong decline in the non-Orthodox world, Jewishly. And we also see what Eddie refers to as this reawakening, really a kind of reemergence of Jewish life, which I think is the mechemta to all of the population studies. So there are little bursts, little pockets of innovation that are happening both within large communities and congregations. Many of you in this room are responsible for a lot of that great change that's happening, and also the creation of totally new entities that nobody imagined before. Some live and die within a couple of years, and some are actually shaking up the establishment in a way and causing us to ask different questions than we were before. I noticed about 10 years ago that of all the Jews I met, and I kind of made a study of talking to unaffiliated Jews because I was fascinated as a new rabbi with why it was that so many people weren't even coming in the doors for the good stuff. And I made a point of going out and speaking to hundreds of people who were really disconnected Jewishly. And what I realized was that what they were rejecting actually had nothing to do with Judaism. They weren't rejecting the idea of living our lives on a rhythm of perfection, right? In which after 6 days of work, every 7th day, we would stop and we would reimagine what was possible in the world. We would redream. We would redream, in the words of Tamar Elad Applebaum, what we might be able to create as Jews and as human beings in the world. That's not what they were rejecting. They weren't rejecting the idea of powering down and creating space for something holy to happen. They weren't rejecting the idea of community. These are the very same people who are hungry for community, for the ability to come together and build sacred and meaningful relationships and connections with each other. What they were rejecting was a kind of passivity that many people feel is very strongly reflected in the American Jewish communal establishment. We were reading yesterday from The God Who Hates Lies about Hartman's criticism of Jewish life in the diaspora, which he argued was fundamentally a passive life as opposed to the active life of a Jew in Israel. It's a kind of passivity that is rejected. It's a fear-driven identification. What they reject is rigidity. It's the idea that things can never change because this is the way it has always been. And if you don't believe that this is characteristic of American Jewish community, ask a rabbi who's tried to change the time of Shabbos services from 8 p.m. to 7:45 p.m. and see if the perception that there's a rigidity in American Jewish life is true or not. What they reject is invisibility. The idea that I can walk into a space and instead of feeling like I'm at home and like I actually matter here, I feel like I don't matter at all. Nobody even sees me, nobody knows me. It would make no difference if I walked right out. And I think what many of them reject is infantilization, right? That I'm being talked down to. That in all other spheres of my life, I am pushed to succeed and to succeed with extraordinary talent. And these are people who can be incredibly successful professionally. And when they walk into the Jewish communal space that they find themselves in, they feel like they're being spoken to like second graders. Now, part of that was a strategic decision that our community made several decades ago because we didn't want to alienate anybody. But as a result, we've ended up alienating more people because what we find about this demographic, and Stephen Cohen, correct us if we're wrong, but this is a generation of people, in particular 20s and 30s, millennials, next-gen people. These are people who really want to be challenged, actually. And even though we call them the most narcissistic generation in the history of the world, so Mazel tov if you're part of this generation. Even though this is a generation that was born and bred on the iPod and then the iPad, that has instant access to whatever we want, can buy it and then delete it, never in our lives have the experience, and I'm still for a few more months part of this demographic, never having the experience of having to sit and listen to the radio hoping that your song comes on, because you just buy your song and then you delete it when you're done, right? There's a kind of cultural narcissism that emerges in a culture of instant gratification, where we can get our hands on whatever we want, exactly when we want it, and then walk away and move on to the next thing. As opposed to a culture of sitting in a beit midrash and studying for 6 weeks a piece of Gemara to get to the end, and it says tegu, right? There's no answer. You're here for the journey. So these are two conflicting cultures. And so, you know, it makes sense that there's a precipitous decline in engagement. If you look at sort of the cultural reality that's right now guiding the American communal space, and then all more so on top of that, the American Jewish communal agenda of the previous century, which we all know was guided by the 3 principles of anti-Semitism, Israel in crisis, and we must remember the Holocaust, which simply, even though all 3 of those things still remain of critical importance, no longer serves a driving force in the creation of identity. And so what we're witnessing right now is a reemergence that's born out of an insistence that a Jewish life that will be truly vibrant and truly compelling for a generation of people who really are hungry for that has to be rooted in and driven by a different set of cultural assumptions. One that's not passive, one that doesn't infantilize people, one that actually sees people when they walk in the door, rather than hoping that they don't feel invisible but not taking active steps to prevent them from feeling that way. One that's flexible and fluid and creative. And what inspires me about this moment in time is that that's exactly what we see happening in so many places, both within and without the established Jewish community, that people are actually taking hold of their own Jewish experience and reclaiming it in many ways, redreaming it.
So you use the language of reawakening and you use the language of reemergence. And I appreciate in both of your cases talking in actually profoundly optimistic language about what is fundamentally possible in the Jewish community. And I think both of your institutions are reflective of that. And at the same time, and I want to share the bad news, there are a lot of institutions, mainstream Jewish organizations, synagogues, who are struggling with declining patterns of affiliation and membership, right? A transactional approach to membership where I am a member so long as my needs are provided for me, and then when my needs are no longer provided, I leave the room. I met with a rabbi in Boston who said he had, and they said this happens once a year, that the membership form itself gets mailed back to the synagogue with a note handwritten on it: we no longer require the services of the synagogue, right? So actually not even, thank you, Rabbi, for what we've done, but I no longer require the services of the synagogue. And many of the rabbis in the room I know are experiencing the challenge of what it means to run an institution that may not be positioned for the reawakening and the reemergence of what that you've both been describing. And so I want to ask the hard question of what happens when if we're having a religious reawakening with an institutional communal structure that's not prepared for it, and what it means to have a reemergence of a Judaism that people want to have in an environment that's positioned for a Judaism that they may no longer want.
Look, it is absolutely true. We have created over the course of the previous century a cash for service Judaism in America. This is not a relational Judaism. This is a fee-for-service engagement. You pay us your money, and we will provide you with a variety of services. And it's disturbing. It's disturbing for all of us, right? None of us want to be on the receiving end of this because we feel like we're being used. And yet, that culture doesn't shift until we shift it, right? We're the only ones who actually can change that dynamic. And we need to say to people from the outset, we are building this membership based on relationships, sacred relationships, in which we have sacred obligations to one another, right? And expectations of one another. It's not just you pay me $1,800, I'll give a good sermon at your kid's bar mitzvah, We're actually sharing a vision of what is possible in the Jewish world and in the world more broadly. We believe in this shared vision, and we're going to work together to make it happen. Part of that is you're going to pay me $1,800, and I'm going to give a killer sermon at your kid's bar mitzvah, right? But it's based on a shared vision, right? I think all the time about Rambam's differentiation of the 3 levels of chaver, right? So there's a chaver l'davar, which is somebody with whom you share some basic utilitarian need. You need that person needs you. You have a basic understanding of that arrangement, and everybody's fine with it. And then there's a chaver l'daga, the person with whom you share some of life's more profound moments. You worry for them when they're sick and when they're upset. Life is more meaningful when you're together. And then there's a chaver l'idea, someone with whom you share a vision of what's possible in the world. We're responsible for the culture of fee-for-service because we built our institutions on a chaver l'davar model. And that doesn't change until we stand up and we speak confidently about this and say, guess what? Things are changing now. You're not happy and I'm not happy. I don't like being used and you don't like paying a check when you're not invested in a relationship with me for real. So let's start to reorient ourselves toward building something together. And our institutions right now are not designed for this kind of relationship, but they will only be once we actually work to transform the language and the culture of those institutions.
There was a Broadway show called Titanic. It came out the same year the movie came out. And my mother-in-law, who was very generous, got us tickets, so we went to go see this at the Amundsen, which is the big music center in LA. It's a wonderful show. First half of the show, Act 1, you get introduced to all the different characters on the ship, the various classes, the crew of the ship. They give you the whole story of the magic ship. And just before intermission, the ship hits the iceberg. And then you go to intermission. When we came back from intermission, half the theater was empty. And we were sitting in some really expensive seats, and everybody on the row was gone. Half the people in the theater left. Because nobody wants to be on a sinking ship. Because nobody wants that story. So the first thing is, we have to decide what we want to talk about. You want to talk about bad news? I'm a rabbi. I can do that all night. I can filibuster. I can tell you about demographic declines, crashing memberships, dissolving institutions, leadership crisis, financial crisis. Crisis is my middle name. I can tell you, I can make you weep about how bad it is in the American Jewish community. It's really not that hard. Except nobody wants to hear it. And it doesn't serve anybody's purposes. And it just gives us a sort of a, I don't know, it gives us sort of a thrill. Jews have this sort of thrill. You know, once my Zayda used to read the Yiddish papers, and he'd shake his head and say, Schwerz ist eine Yid. It's hard to be a Jew. And he was descriptive. Now it's become proscriptive, you know? If it isn't schwer, it's not like authentically Jewish, you know? If you haven't depressed people, it isn't really Jewish. No chrein, no gain. The modern Seder plate is 5 portions of horseradish and a little bit of charosis. Come on. Of course. Yes, institutions are going to change. Here's the interesting news. If you've learned nothing else in this Beit Midrash, it's that institutions have always been changing. Thank God we don't have the Romans to destroy a temple anymore. And we don't have Cossacks to make pogroms anymore. Thank God the changes, our demographic changes, carried out in an environment of liberty. They don't want to kill us anymore. They want to marry us. My Zayda used to say, Zayda, there's so much service for the Jewish people. And he'd say, yes, and it's bad service. Bad service. He says, look, you're always going to have service. You're always going to have problems. The question is, what's the quality of your service? I'm going to submit to you, Professor Kurtzer, that the service that we are wrestling with tonight is gloriously golden service compared to the service we wrestled with 50, 60, 70 years ago. I have to worry about my kid marrying out of the Jewish people and disaffiliating and not coming to shul Shabbos because he's got other things, he's got an iPad. I mean, come on. This morning in the newspaper, the president of Princeton University declared that he's now Jewish. He discovered that he's Jewish. Princeton University! They're not really, for a long time you couldn't get into Princeton University. Now the president just comes out of the closet and he's Jewish. All right, so having said that, you're right. What Sharon says is very important. You know, Stephen and Arnie Eisen wrote this amazing book called The Jew Within. If you haven't read this book, buy it and read it out loud to everyone you know. It is a wonderful observation of the American Jewish community. And what they did was extend a finding that came about the team of sociologists at Berkeley led by Robert Bellah, which is simply that in American life, the language of American life is individualism, and the language of American ideology is the sovereign self. So when a sovereign self approaches any institution, they come in the guise of a consumer. Because as a consumer, the sovereign self can control the transaction. American Jews, like Americans in general, are dearly afraid of commitment. You know the old joke. The chicken and the salmon go for a walk, and they see a sign, lox and eggs breakfast for charity. And the chicken says, come, we'll go in, it looks like fun. The salmon says, gee, I don't know. And the chicken says, come on, come on, come on, we'll go in, it's good for a good cause. And the salmon says, I don't know. And the chicken says, what's holding you back? He says, look, lox and eggs. From you, they want a contribution. From me, they want commitment. The sovereign self does not want to join. The sovereign self does not want to engage because the sovereign self interprets any engagement, any relationship as a claim on the self's liberty. And as a claim on its liberty, it is a diminishment of self. If I'm obligated, if I'm responsible, it becomes a diminishment of self. So in the American Jewish community, we created something called the private bar mitzvah, which is about as authentic as a milchik lamb chop. Because the whole notion of a bar mitzvah is to welcome a child into a sitting community of Jews who are responsible for each other's material and physical and spiritual lives, and instead we're going to have this as a private affair. I don't have to feed the shul, the kiddush, I'll just have my own friends and family there, and my rabbi. Consumer. The problem for my colleagues is we have been complicit in creating this culture because we speak this language. So the first thing we have to do is stop being complicit with this language and start talking the language of covenant, as Sharon does. We have to learn a new language. I was not taught this language at JTS. I was not taught this language when at Camp Rama. I was not taught this language when I was growing up. It is a new language I have to learn how to talk. Membership. Membership is what you join when you join a country club. Membership. Covenanting. To be a chaver. To be involved in each other's lives. A new language. A new language. Now what's threatening about that? What's threatening about that is that synagogues in particular, and generally Jewish institutions, are hybrids. We're an institutional box containing a sacred community. And the two have to coexist. And if you support the sacred community and ignore the institutional box, you'll soon be out of a job. And the question is, how do you support the institutional box and at the same time nourish the sacred community? And what Sharon is suggesting, and I think she's absolutely right, is that we have it backwards. We have put in too much effort and endeavor in the institutional box, and it's time to nurture sacred communities and allow institutional boxes to take their own course. Abraham Joshua Heschel, in 1964, was invited to the GA. Interesting thing, he was only invited once. Any of you who do lecturing know that if you're invited once, it's because you said something. In 1964, Abraham Joshua Heschel said, it's time to retire two words from our vocabulary, surveys and survival. Because the problem isn't the demographics of the community, nor is the problem simply survival. It's a question of creating communities of meaning, communities of engagement, communities of inspiration. That's the new language that this community has to learn how to speak. And what will come out of that is a different kind of community. It will be smaller. It may not have as much money, but it will be real. And that's all we ask.
Yeah, I want First of all, you see what I mean about sitting on a panel with Rabbi Ed Feinstein. So I want to say something about the good service. First of all, my mom, we grew up in a big Reform synagogue temple in New Jersey, and my mom was once invited to be one of the speakers on Yom Kippur afternoon. There were 3 speakers, and one spoke about having survived a terrorist attack, one spoke about having a sick child, and my mom was invited to speak about having 1 kid who grew up to be religious and 2 kids who made Aliyah. And we titled her talk, "You Think You've Got Surahs?" Like, what could be worse? This is not what we expected for our children. So I want to just say, you're right about the good service, obviously, and it's a time of incredible abundance and real privilege in our community. But what comes with good service is something that's incredibly pernicious, and if we're not careful, could actually destroy the Jewish community from the inside. And we see it happening, which is a kind of spiritual anorexia, a total disengagement from what it means to be a Jew in the world and what it means to be a human being who comes with the legacy and the inheritance of being a Jew. And I mean, this is what we saw with Joseph when he starts curling his eyelashes, right? When he gets a little too comfortable in Potiphar's home. A spiritual anorexia, says Nechama Leibowitz, and I see it and feel it in the American Jewish community, and I'm sure many of you do as well. It's a sense of deep detachment and disconnect from what it even means to be a Jew and a human being in the world today. So the question is, how do we turn that around right now? And I want to say, my husband and I watched this a great TED Talk from Bob Mankoff, who's the cartoon editor from The New Yorker. It's just a funny and great one. He's the one who actually authored the really famous cartoon that says, "No, Thursday's out. How about never? Does never work?" And he was talking about why it is that that's so funny. And he said it's about a kind of cognitive synergy that happens when you take 2 competing elements and you thrust them together. So it's about both politeness and rudeness in exactly the same voice. And we, as intelligent people, can actually hold that kind of complexity. And so that's why the only love that can really be powerful is a critical love, right? A love where, like Reish Lakish Rabbi Yochanan, where you can actually say to your chavruta, you can do better than that. Right? That's what real love is, we learn. So he says it's about, there's something about sort of thrusting together 2 competing elements that gives new vitality to both of them. Because if you don't have the politeness, then you're just rude. And you don't have the rudeness, then you're just boring. And so what it is about kind of creating a new energy or a new spirit that can hold that kind of complexity. And I suspect that this might be part of at least some piece of a remedy to some of the spiritual anorexia that really is about boredom in our community. I mean, several people have written about this lately. I think Gary Rosenblum wrote a piece about this, and others, but that what will kill the American Jewish community is boredom. Jews are just plain bored. So I was thinking, as we're watching Bob Mankoff, I'm thinking that's exactly right. It's about taking elements that don't seem like they should go together, like thrusting right into the middle of a city that for so many people is defined by division and strife, a center for pluralism. Right? This is what works, taking ideas that seem completely competing and throwing them together. So taking the old and thrusting it together with the completely new, right? Not rejecting or abandoning the old for the sake of the new, and not doing the old in the same old way, but taking the old and doing it in a new way, taking the pious and the sincere and doing it in a way that's incredibly impious and funny, like Ed Feinstein over here to my right. Right? It's about having a conversation that is deeply personal and touches people in their hearts, really moves people to tears personally and privately, but in a communal space where they're with other people who are having a really similar private journey, even on very different trajectories. It's about helping people realize that we can be both particular and universal in the same moment, that the best way to be a good human being in the world is to be a good Jew in the world, right? Taking these competing elements and throwing them together, and it just strikes me that at this moment of boredom and anorexia, that maybe the response is surprise, right? Taking 2 dimensions. I heard a talk on NPR that was given by a guy who's a professor of ethnomusicology, who's actually an old friend of mine, and he was talking about this device that DJs use, really good DJs, called the crossfader. Any DJs in the room? I'm sure there must be at least 100 or 200 here. And here's what happens. They take two songs that sound like they have nothing to do with each other, and a really good DJ knows how to blend them together so beautifully that all of a sudden you enter into a totally different musical landscape than you ever would have let yourself enter into, and it blows your mind, right? You have a completely different experience than you would otherwise. So it strikes me that part of what works in the communities that are working is being able to take these competing elements and thrusting them together, creating surprise, and creating discomfort, a kind of magical, disruptive discomfort that awakens us from the good service of boredom.
I feel like I should throw out this question list.
Surprise!
Yeah. Well, let me share with you a story of also of being invited once to the GA. Because I want to throw out one question about the North American Jewish community in Israel, and then I do want to open it up to the audience to ask. I was asked to come to the GA. I told you the story yesterday. The General Assembly of Jewish Federations of North America. I was asked to come speak to what they call the Development Leadership Institute, which is the professionals who run fundraising campaigns in the Jewish community and their lay peers who are the chairs of fundraising campaigns. And they said, can you come speak to this Development Leadership Institute, which meets for a full day before the General Assembly begins, and can you give us 10 to 15 minutes on how we should be talking about Israel to continue to raise money for the federations? I said, great. I got up and I gave a talk in which I said that raising money on the basis of crisis in Israel is it's inaccurate because it doesn't tell the story of the modern state of Israel. It is unethical because it plays on people's fears rather than giving them something to aspire for. And it's fundamentally anti-Zionist because the state of Israel was not meant to have a paternalistic uncle in America who was... it was fundamentally anti-Zionist because it was this paternalistic voice of North American Jewry which was saving the people of Israel from their constant crises. I got very polite applause, as I said. It was a one-time invite, and I was followed.
It's a compliment. You don't understand. If they never invite you back, that's the highest compliment.
I was followed to the stage by a federation head who was the respondent, who said, yes to all the things that Yehuda just said, but my campaign is built on the basis of crisis. Said I don't have 6 months to try to promote a different type of optimistic conversation in Jewish life. I don't have 6 months to talk about Israel in an aspirational language that will get people to feel excited about it. What my campaign is built on the basis of donors who need that crisis as their lifeblood. What you've described, both of you, I think really articulately and profoundly, is the possibility that optimism, enthusiasm, energy awakening can actually animate Jewish institutions in ways that I think would surprise a lot of folks out there in the Jewish world who are constantly talking about demise. But there is another narrative of Jewish life that also works. And first of all, I want to ask the question of what happens to the utility of that narrative, right? What happens when, it's very clear that for your optimistic, energetic narrative does not nearly have the same staying power with respect to feelings of Zionism, peoplehood, and support for the state of Israel, right? And what happens when we are totally succumbing to a language of optimism and enthusiasm when we become subject totally to market forces as opposed to a story that helped animate Jewish life until at least now.
You have nothing to worry about, Doctor. The Jewish people will never succumb to optimism. Never. The great Moses, the hand of God took us out of Egypt. We crossed the Red Sea. We gathered in a dance with Miriam HaNeviah, and we sang Michamocha Ba'elim Adonai, and 3 days later we were kvetching again. Sharon and I, neither one of us owns a stick that turns into a snake. I mean, don't worry about optimism taking over the soul of the Jewish people. It ain't gonna happen, right? But here's, the answer to your question is very simple. It's in the question itself. What do you mean when you say, it works? mean when a rabbi says that he or she is successful? What does a rabbi mean when he or she says, I'm challenged? What does a synagogue mean when a synagogue measures itself and says, we're doing well? By what metric? By what measurement? By what set of criteria and standards and values? Typically, we do this quantitatively because that's lazy people's thinking. So, how many people show up to your shul on a Shabbos when there's no bar mitzvah? Okay? Right? I have 1,600 members. That means I'm a bigger rabbi than a lot of you guys. I mean, there's a little Freudian in that too, by the way. But, you know, I mean, what are you talking about? And how many of these people are engaged? How many are touched? How many are moved? When we pray, with what level of kavanah do we pray? I mean, even, you know, we learned this here in this Beit Midrash. The rabbis of the Mishnah, when they set the whole system up, right? Rabbi Gamliel said you have to pray all 18 or 19 of the Shemona Esrei. Rabbi Yeshua said do the short version. Rabbi Akiva said depends on how long it takes you to read the prayer. And then Rabbi Eliezer ben Organist, who's no lightweight, said, if this is keva, ain't no tachlunim, it's not prayer. You're measuring prayer by the wrong number. Not by how many brachot you say, but with what level of kavanah do you pray? With what depth of meaning do we associate? The answer to your question is yes. It's an addiction. Crisis is an addiction. And like any drug, it works the first time. It gets you high. But the next time, you need a bigger hit of the drug to get the same high. And by the third time, you need a double hit of the drug. And by the fourth time, you can't get off of the drug, but it no longer really gets you high. And that's the story of the American Jewish community. How many times can you go back and say, Gewalt, your demise, and Holocaust all over again. Hitler, 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 before a generation of young Jews say, Genug schon, enough. I'm not going to take it anymore. I'm not going to listen to this anymore. I'm not going to listen to it anymore. Why is birthright successful? Because birthright isn't about crisis. Birthright is about the joy of living in a society of meaning and purpose. The spirit of purpose that animates Israeli society. Not just crisis, 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 crisis. Right? The drug doesn't work anymore, and we're addicted to it. Yes, and there's a withdrawal when you put down the syringe. And that's what we're going to have to go through. And it's going to hurt. But it's the only way to get back to some sort of sanity in this community. Because there aren't enough anti-Semites left in the world to scare Jews. I live near the Wiesenthal Center, which is a wonderful place. They do great stuff. And I'm on one of their mailing lists. And they send me big black envelopes with red lettering on the outside. The danger facing the Jews. You know, the only one who really worries is my mailman. Poor guy knocked on the door one day and he says, Rabbi, is everything okay? Sweet morning guy. Is there anything we can do? I said, you know, I'm so excited. He says, I deliver these things to you every day. His Wiesenthal people and his ADL people and his other people. I said, I'm worried about it. It's so nice having you in the neighborhood. I'm glad to have it to you. I said, don't worry, we're okay. Well, we've managed for a long time. It's an addiction, and it's time to put it down. The only way you're going to animate this generation, as Sharon said so beautifully, is with a sense of purpose. People want to belong. They want to be a big Torah community. People want to have a sense that their lives matter, and people want to know that they're attached in an authentic way to a tradition that brings purpose to their lives. Now, that's not going to raise you all the money the first year, but it'll give you an abiding connection with a generation for the future.
Can I respond? First of all, I was interviewed for an article in the Israeli press last month or 2 months ago, and we did a very long interview, but we interviewed in English, and he has great Hebrew, and so he translated it, and I was a little bit nervous about one particular section and asked him if he could send me the quotes before the paper came, before the piece came out. And he did send it to me, and I noticed that as he translated, the word optimistic appeared maybe 17 times in like 3 paragraphs, and I said, come on, aren't there any synonyms for optimistic in Hebrew? And he said, no, there really aren't. There aren't many variations on that, and I was thinking, you know, how many words do we have for gratitude? And yet optimistic, it's just, you know, one is enough, and we take that from the English. So, I just want to, just calls to mind what Eddie's saying, this moment that was for me epiphanous when I was a first-year college student, when Khalid Muhammad, who was the spokesperson for the Nation of Islam, was invited to my university to give a talk on the death of Malcolm X. And I was a student of history and very, very interested in hearing what he would have to say, primarily because I believed that, at least Malcolm X believed, that it was the Nation of Islam that would be responsible for his death, so I was wondering how he would wiggle out of it. And so I approached with total intellectual curiosity, Ferris Booth Hall, to hear the great speaker that night, and outside there were about 600 angry Jews who were chanting and screaming and holding signs that say, no anti-Semites on campus. So I wasn't particularly affiliated or connected to the Jewish community, and I was slightly embarrassed, to be honest with you. And I thought, you know, this is a place of intellectual curiosity and openness, and we should hear what this man has to say. I went in, and of course, all he talked about was how the Holocaust never happened, and so after about 19 minutes, I stormed out of the room, and I didn't look back. So the next day, there was a letter that was written and put in the mailboxes of all of the Jews on campus, or people with Jewish-sounding last names. Okay, so I didn't get one, but David did, and my husband, and so I saw it, and it said, what's wrong with us, people? What does it come to? That 600 Jews show up for a protest against, yes, an anti-Semite, but we had Simchat Torah a couple weeks ago, and there were like 4 Jews and a Torah on the steps, and nobody could have cared less about what was going on. He said, this is the end of the Jewish people unless we can turn this around. And I was so moved by this letter. If anybody knows who wrote it, please tell me, because I want to thank him, because I really think about it now whenever we celebrate Simchat Torah, and the place is just packed with hundreds and hundreds of people. Some of them in jeans and like tube tops. I mean, you'd have a heart attack if you saw the way some people come to show. But thank God, they're showing up for Simchat Torah because they understand that in some fundamental way that their Jewish life offers them, or can offer them, some insight into the question of what it means to be a Jew in a very broken world, in a very tumultuous time, when we actually need to look somewhere for some guidance. And so. You know, this is my answer to the optimism. Eddie's absolutely right about this. We can bemoan all the things that are broken, or we can actually put out a different kind of narrative, a counter narrative. And I cried during that tekes a few minutes ago. I wasn't the only one crying, right? Od lo avda tikvatenu. We say it again and again and again. It's hope that's kept the Jewish people alive for thousands of years. It's hope. It's not fear. Right? It's not, we're so scared we're going to all die, so we better stay alive. It's, we actually have a vision of a different kind of future. And that vision is so powerful that it will sustain us through the darkest moments, personally and communally. That's what's kept us alive. We still have this hope. So I absolutely believe that optimistic narrative it's not something new, liberal, feminist, vegetarian, Judaism. It's a good selling point for the young people, but it is deeply embedded in our people's story.
I want to just ask one last question to push back on something that you said, and then I'll open it up for comments. Because you actually, in your description of what's going to have to change, you essentially made a trade. This will work for this generation, but it is not going to work for the next generation, and therefore we have to stop doing it, and we'll have to go through a period of withdrawal. I don't know if people saw this weird internet story that took place a week ago where a professional working at a federation in the States wrote an op-ed called 40 Plus and Screwed, talking about how the overinvestment in young people through birthright and other things has come at the cost of the investment in anyone over the age of 40. And, you know, say what you will about the piece, the result of the piece the following day was that she was fired. actually quite publicly, with an acknowledgement by the Federation head on the same blog of the piece was never vetted by us, it doesn't reflect our policies, and this wasn't done properly. Nevertheless, what it kind of signaled was this shift in orthodoxy has been so heavily towards now, what do we have to do as a Jewish community for the young people, that one can't even say something counter to it. You said, I think actually, implicitly what you said was actually rather harif. We have, the language of withdrawal, drug withdrawal, is that, and it means essentially, I don't know, it's not class warfare, but it is age warfare. No. Right? The trade-off of what we have to give up for an older generation of Jews in order to invest in younger generations.
You want to know what the most dynamic part of the American Jewish community is right now? There's a new demographic. Brand new demographic, you're exactly right. People who are 65 to 90. You see, understand that the lifespan of Americans, of North Americans, of Westerners, has expanded now. It expanded again, by the way, it expanded right after the Second World War. When people, 65 used to be the lifespan. That's why Social Security was set at 65. Medicare was set at 65. Then right after the Second World War, with the invention of the polio vaccine and various other things, it went from 65 to 72. Now, it isn't that people live longer, just longer. It means we add demographic moments. So right after the Second World War, we added the demographic moment of teenage. In 1950, Erik Erikson wrote The 8 Ages of Man, and he said that in your adolescence you have an identity crisis. So every Harvard undergraduate went to the phone, called his mom, and said he's having one. And James Dean was a rebel without a cause, and the Beatles came, and God gave us the Rolling Stones, and suddenly we had teenage. Well, it's happened again. Now the lifespan has expanded from 72 to 85 to 90. And you have new demographic moments. There's 2 of them in particular. One is early adulthood, 22 to 32. When you're allowed to graduate college and bum around the universe, right? You don't have to live anywhere, have any particular relationship, have no vocation, have no values, and just sort of wander the universe, right? Join E-Cart, And then at 32, you get married, have babies, move to the valley, and join Valley Vegetable. You settle down.
You're welcome.
No, it's the truth. And that, by the way, is what's going on. Really, the neighborhoods of people that are that age, and neighborhoods that are settled and have other kinds of demographics. The other demographic, and so the community has invested heavily in that period, 22 to 32, trying to figure out what they need and how do you engage them. There's a whole question about whether you can engage them or whether the demographic cultural moment implies non-engagement. But that's a whole other sort of long conversation. The other demographic moment that a lot of us have noticed is 65 to 90. I mean, when I was a kid, my parents would go away for a couple days of vacation, and Bubby would come and stay with us. And Bubby was this little old European lady, made kugel. Little lady, spoke Yiddish. And then once I calculated her age, she was 55. My dad is 84, and he has some disability, but he's alive. And my teacher, Harold Showeiss, God willing, he's 87, and alive, and thinking, and growing, and engaged. And we've discovered this wonderful demographic. People with time, with commitments, with values, with vision, and they are also searching for truth, for purpose, for community, for meaning, for engagement. And they are also sick of being told that Jewish life is about fear and crisis and destruction and demise and hatred. They also want to love Torah and love God and love the Jewish people. This isn't an age, this isn't a demographic moment. This is a cultural moment that stretches across generations. The woman who wrote that article was absolutely right. There is a disproportionate amount of attention given to the 22 to 32-year-old demographic for many reasons. One of which is what you do in your 20s does not predict what you do in 30s and 40s and up beyond. That's one of the reasons. And second of all, because no one's quite figured out that demographic culture yet. And so she was actually right in that article. It was written in a certain sarcastic way, and I can understand why she raised hackles. I'm sorry she was fired. right? If she lived in LA, she'd have a job with me, but but it's a truth, it's a question of thinking new, not just about a moment of demographic truth, it's across age levels, it's a cultural moment. We have reached the end of the post-Holocaust crisis mentality. It's finished. You can't motivate Jews anymore with that narrative. It's simply, it'll work a little bit, in the same way that a drug will work a little bit after a person's been on it a long time. But it's not going to give you what you're looking for. And it's time to redirect the attention and redirect our metrics from how we measure success in a community. What if you measured success in terms of the depth of kavanah, instead of the numbers of people who show up? What if you measured the depth of success, the meaning of success, in terms of families who are really engaged in Jewish living? Instead of how many families show up on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. Take Sharon's idea. What if you measured success by how joyfully people dance on Simchas Torah, instead of how dreadfully they mourn on Yom Kippur? It's a different way to measure success, and the culture is asking for it now.
I'm going to open up some questions. What I'd like to do and have you go first, what I'm going to have people do is a bunch of questions together, and then our panelists will respond to whichever they want, which parenthetically they would have done anyway. And please no speeches. Okay, right here in front.
Why don't you stand up, tell us who you are and where you're from.
Frank Felton from Boston.
Hi.
So I've heard about the Jerusalem Railroad track and the wonderful spontaneous events that happen on Friday night there and in Tel Aviv. And I'm wondering if our institutions, JCCs and synagogues, are too limiting, and that we haven't devised places in the United States where elder people can study, young people can come together, middle-aged people with families, whatever it might be. That we boxed ourselves in too much and we haven't been flexible enough about trying to create different kinds of structures.
Great.
Steve Cambridge with New York. One thing you skirted and really talked about, you mentioned a little bit, and that is the culture of freedom. You mentioned birthright, but we have a situation now where hundreds of thousands of people who could afford trips to Israel won't go unless it's free. We have thousands, maybe tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands who won't buy Jewish books unless it's free from PJ Library. And that's what's attractive. We have thousands of people, tens of thousands, who won't join synagogues, and so they go to Chabad because it's free. So I think the culture of free plays a major role that we haven't yet confronted, that we need sort of the funds, so it seems, to allow these people to become members of our communities without that financial commitment, even though they could make it. And that's what attracts them.
Question mark.
Thanks, Steve.
Sid Hellbrown, Chicago. My question connects, Sid Hellbrown from Chicago. It connects to that, but it's slightly different. So I'm looking at the language engagement values. I'm wondering about the term obligation or commitment or covenant and how what methods do we use to instill that covenantal or obligation sense in people that isn't guilt, that isn't turning them off or pushing them away, so that they will feel a sense of obligation to do their share, to be involved. Because, I want people to be engaged, but it has to have meaning too, and part of meaning is obligation and doing something yourself. Part of it.
I'm wondering when you talk about engaging young people, if you're talking about young people who are inclined to participate and be involved for those who aren't. And if you're talking about those who aren't, what are you going to do for them?
Okay. So I just actually want to start with Sid's question about obligation, mostly because I had this realization the other day that just actually stopped me in my tracks when I was in the middle of saying a bracha. And maybe this is very obvious, so forgive me if you've all had this thought before, but I had never thought it before. When we say Asher Kitshanu, b'mitzvotav tzivanu. I realized that what we're saying is, you make us holy by asking something of us, right? We become holy when something is asked of us, and that is a gift of God's love, that God cares enough about me to ask me to do something, right? To ask me to wash my hands before I eat the meal. And it just struck me all of a sudden that the relationships that are most meaningful for all of us in our lives, our personal relationships, our partnerships, our friendships, our business relationships, are the ones where something is asked of us. And yet in shul, what do we ask of people? Just the check, again. And so I feel like part of this, it really is a culture shift. It's about helping people understand that the language of obligation is actually the language of holiness. And if you've ever engaged a lay leader, or if you're a lay leader and you've been engaged this way, you know the power of it, right? When someone identifies you and says, I want you to chair High Holy Days this year, right? And you say, me? What do I bring? And that person says, you bring everything. I've been watching you. You're so organized. You're on top of things. People don't hate you. They'll return your phone calls, right? And all of a sudden you think, like, someone notices me and is asking something of me, and it totally changes your relationship with the organization or with the association. So I think that the language of obligation is about a deeper understanding that obligation is actually about creating holiness. And I just want to say also to Shira, do you want to just pick two, or okay? So about engaging young people, we in our community we haven't done any marketing. We actually, the one ad that we took out was the first year, High Holy Days, we started in 2004, and we took out a teeny tiny little box amid great controversy among the founders of our community, because we didn't think we should advertise, and that said, it doesn't have to hurt, High Holy Days, 57, 64, or 65. So is that right? Yeah. So we don't advertise for young people, come here, this is the young professionals hotspot, this is where all the young people are meeting each other. We just try to put out really good Torah, and people are hungry for it. And we try to do it in a way that reduces the barriers that turn people off. So for example, people who come in a generation that is severely allergic to institutional environments, right? That will have such a deep and profound resistance to walking into institutional environments, would love to go to their friend's house for dinner. So why not bring the Torah to their friend's house for dinner, right? And why not? I mean, we've been doing house parties. We did them every single week for the first 7 years of Ikar, which is, I would ask hosts, what are you and your friends talking about? What do you care about? And they would say, oh, we're struggling with eating, and body image issues, or what does it mean to turn 30 and still be single, or issues of homosexuality, or how could the tsunami happen? What's going on in the world? Or is there ever going to be peace, right? And then we would craft text studies around those issues, but not hold them in the shul. We'd hold them in people's living rooms and in bars and in cafes and in places that young people aren't scared of and aren't allergic to. And what we found was that they really liked Torah. They just don't like having to walk through 4 security checkpoints to get to the Torah. So why not bring it out to where the people actually are? And people's guards are let down much more there. So in a way, it's about creating points of access for people to the good stuff, right? And I'm just going to say one more thing, because Eddie really wisely pointed out, and we've never spoken about this before, but how the Christian world is in some ways 10 or 20 years ahead of the Jewish world. And I remember I was at a conference right when Ikar started, and we didn't have a map or a guide or a model. We were just sort of going on instinct based on our experiences with people who were really deeply disaffected, and kind of building out this model. And we got together with a bunch of Christian emergents, right? They actually already had a name because they were 10 years ahead of us. Were you at this conference? And one of them explained the origin story of the Christian emergent community. And what they said was that there was some mega church in Arizona, I think, where there were like 40,000 members, and they built a campus of 40,000 acres. And the pastor of the megachurch, I don't know if you remember this comment, but the pastor of the megachurch, his son is in seminary. His son's 22 years old. He comes to see what his father's built, and his father walks him around this whole campus and puts his arm around him and says, "Son, one day all of this will be yours." And his son looks at his dad and says, "Dad, I don't want any of this. I want a few good friends, a few good beers, and some Bibles. And I want to try to figure out what God is asking of us in the world." Right? We have created such institutional barriers to people actually trying to figure out what God is asking of us in the world. And then there's so much noise out there in the world. There are 5,500 people in the U.S. at least who've died from gun violence since Newtown, right? There's terrorism and violence and so much war and so much pain that's the noise of the universe we're living in. And we say, you want to talk about what's important, so first you have to violate your own allergy, right? In order to go into the space where the conversation's being held. People in this moment are so hungry to engage in a meaningful conversation about what we can do to live meaningful lives and to help change the way the world looks. And we shouldn't make them have to fight to even get in the door.
Good record of answering questions. Doctors have patients. Lawyers have clients. Teachers have students. Politicians have constituents. What do rabbis have? What word do we use for them? Rabbis? Congregants? Members? Lay people? How do you say that in Hebrew? What does the Gemara call that? Is there a word for non-rabbinic people? Think about that for a minute. We have adopted a Christian vocabulary to describe the norms of our relationship. We are rabbis. We possess Torah, truth, holiness. We're closer to God. You are lay people. You're down there. What are you to us? Are you our bosses? The material out of which we shape our lives? Are we here to sculpt you? Are you an obstacle, a challenge? What are the norms that define these relationships? What are the unspoken assumptions about our relationship, about what I am as rabbi and what you are as Jew? One of those relationships, those norms are Christian norms, where priests, where ministers are holy people, possessed of the Spirit of God, and you all don't have it, but you have to come to me to get it. Another one is an economic model, where you pay money so that I can eat. The rabbis had this right, by the way. Rabbis in the Gemara in the Talmudic times had jobs. They had real jobs. That way, money didn't get in the way of the relationship. Then we could really talk to each other. And didn't have to worry that if I piss you off, you're going to fire me. Or if I don't say the right thing, or if I don't show up to your kid's bar mitzvah in the right mood, you're going to fight. Because then the rabbi has a degree of independence. I think that institutions are terribly important to the Jewish community because they provide frameworks for the creation of new forms of sacred community. So in answer to Fran's question, you're exactly right. Isn't it interesting that the biggest room in every one of our synagogues is the place for prayer? And that's the one thing American Jews don't know how to do. When David built this place, he built a Beit Midrash, not a Beit Knesset. What if instead of having a big room with chairs where you pray, we had a big room with chairs where you learned? Or no big room at all? What if you had a bunch of little rooms? What if we reorganize? In other words, the institution, if it's done properly, gives the flexibility to experiment. And that's what I think our institutions are for. They're they're laboratories. They're laboratories, centers of experimentation in sacred community life. And I think that what's called upon, you're exactly correct, is that rabbis today and leaders of communities have to be relentlessly experimental, relentlessly innovative. In my community, we have a very basic rule. You don't know how to do anything until you've screwed it up 3 times. So go fail. Gesundheit, go fail. And when the people who work with me come to me, they say, I tried this, and it was so great, and it failed terribly. I say, Mazel tov. Mazel tov. Now you're into something. Let's see how many more times we can fail at it. Because eventually, that's how you get to this relentless experimentation. You're exactly correct. And part of that relentless experimentation, we have to figure out a new set of norms to govern our relationship. Right? It can no longer be you coming to me for truth or Ruach HaKodesh. We have to become partners. We have to figure out a new way of organizing and structuring this partnership. That's the answer to the obligation question, Sid. Right? The obligation question is, it's not that I'm gonna obligate, or I'm gonna preach obligation and you're gonna accept the obligation or not accept the obligation. Can we build a community together? Can we build meaningful lives together? And Steve, the question is a bigger question than the culture of free, although you're absolutely correct that it's a huge challenge. It's even a bigger question. Money. What has money done to the sacred communities of Jewish life in North America? And what would happen if you took money out of the equation? I mean, the Chabad thing's an interesting idea, although I believe that Chabad rabbis actually eat. But the question is, if you took money out of it, what if, I wouldn't know. What if membership meant membership and not moneyship? What if giving meant giving of the soul and not giving of money? What if we took money, just as an experiment in a long flight home? Give this some thought. What would the community look like if money wasn't an issue? If you could really organize the community the way you would want to if money wasn't an issue. Let's start with that conversation. And let's consider how we can put this thing back. Who would have thought that David Hartman could collect the money for a place like this? Turns out that if you talk the language of authentic Torah and a meaningful life, wonderful people will show up with checkbooks. Right? At least it looks that way. I'd like to try. So I think this is the kind of relentless experimentation, innovation, and radical thinking that the moment demands of us.
I'm sure there are a lot more questions. It has been a long day. I want to thank Rabbi Sharon Brous.